It would be a typical League of Legends game as any other. The teams were invading, the mid laners were trading, the bot laners were diving each other as usual, and the top laners were farming as if nothing has changed. But one day, Aset was walking top lane, and he looked at his item list and wondered where the variety in AD items has gone. It's 2025, and this will be League of Legends' 15-year anniversary. Now, I've only been playing League since the time Aurelia got reworked, so I'm still a little new to this franchise. Definitely haven't been playing long enough to see the beginning of the Faker era of League of Legends, and not early enough to know about all the obscure shit from the beta. I'm more of a League casual, like some would say, even though I've been playing this game for years now. League of Legends, at this point, is a very steady game. It's slow, sometimes matches could be 20 minutes, but nowadays matches are usually 30 to 40 minutes regardless of how good either team is. When I first started League, I dealt with champions like newly reworked Akali and Aurelia, who were terrorizing the Rift, and Aatrox still wasn't even considered a meta pick until people started to build him with Conquer, and that took months for people to start doing. Even then, the game had so much more variety. Every match felt a little different, and I kind of wanted to talk about the items and the items that we've lost in the expansion of their new legendary item system. A lot of the items feel kind of out of place currently, like they feel like they're missing something, and that might be due to them being mythics and some of them losing their mythic passives and bonuses. Eclipse, every time I build it now, for example, just feels completely gutted. It feels like an item that was made for a different game. Yet I still build it every single game because it's that solid of an item on Aatrox and Riven. And I'm starting to notice this issue across the board in many different roles. Whenever I fill ADC, some of the items just feel pointless. I genuinely only see one or two champions that build Terminus, and I just never see that item at all, despite it having such a great passive. Same with Static Shiv, and there's not even a Stormrazor currently on live. I wanted to kind of deep dive on the active items, and the fact that we lost so many of them. A core one for me personally just being Bork. Blade of the Ruined King is a very meta-defining item, and this item has been in League since the beginning. As I've gotten better at the game and went through my phases playing Vayne and other champions, I've started to realize that we lost something along the way. There was a point in time where Bork had an active, and the active was very simple. You slow someone by 25% and you gain 25% movement speed. Now, modern League, that's not a thing anymore. The fact that Mist Edge is now a passive and you have no way to activate it on a specific target means you just have no way to slow down key people in team fights, which leads to ADC feeling kind of less impactful when you're going for certain builds. Bork will never not be a core item for characters like Vayne or Ashe or Varus because the passive paired with their own passives make it an amazing item. So the item's removal would make these characters almost non-functional in some team fights for more advanced players. I kind of started to wonder if one day Riot will ever go back to active items. And I understand newer players just don't use them, but at what point is simplifying the game a benefit? At what point is it a detriment? We've lost items like Twin Shadows, ZZ Rot is now a passive to Grubs, and other things like that as well. Despite the simplicity, this also comes back down to skill expression. Now, I know champions like Aatrox and Riven have had their spotlight in the meta, especially when items like Spirit Trojan used to be completely broken, with their passive just reducing your cooldowns on a hit to the point where you could get off multiple Rs in one single fight. I definitely don't miss that, because in the event of trying to make new and fresh items, there's going to be hiccups along the way, so I expect items to be overtuned now and then. But to completely remove active items from the game and only keep a very few, like Shirelia's, really makes me feel disgusted in a way. There was utility in some items. Twin Shadows having the slow and reveal. We used to have items like Wrecker, and that was basically the equivalent of having a Volibear on your team, but everyone could build that. And the uniqueness of having your own build path that you could do is just kind of gone nowadays. A lot of the power nowadays comes from champions, but that also means your champions are much more volatile. Right now, Neyfiri is one of the most frustrating junglers right now, and because of the way her kit works, it's just the easiest dive you'll ever see. You just go under a turret, press Q, W, and walk away. And there's really no counterplay to it other than not being low enough health for her to kill you. Meanwhile, in the past, we used to have items like Prowler's Claw, which was a targeting item that would just let you do more damage and do a little bit of damage to your target. At least there, the assassin would have to preemptively know what they're gonna do, and without these actives, I feel like people just kind of don't care what they build anymore. And that also comes down to item build variety. AD champions don't have too many items they can build. You have 1 or 2 core builds that you're going to do in almost every matchup, and it never changes. I don't understand why AD champs get very little variety, and when you look at AP items, a Swain could build burst damage, a Swain could build sustain with Leandries and Riftmaker. LeBlanc can always just build a Hextech Revolver and burst items like Storm Surge. And you even have the tank ones like Abyssal Mask, which is a amazing item because it's an aura that just gives 30% magic resist shred, which is an insane item to have in the current state the game's in. Let's say you don't want to build a Void Staff, you can always build Bloodletter's Curse. But what do you do as an AD champion to counter that? You don't really have too many ways to increase AD damage across the board outside of your one armor pen item. Some champions like Darius are lucky to have passives that give them bonus armor shred, but in the current state League's in, it feels like AD champions don't get that many options. You can always go Wei bot lane, and Wei can always build the same items that are going to give him enough penetration to where it doesn't really matter what the enemy top lane tank builds. And if they do go tank, the only option that person has is Koenig Frukern, because at a certain point, Spirit Visage isn't really worth it if you don't have any sustain in your kit. Or if you're on the other hand building Force of Nature, sometimes you just can't catch up to them. A lot of ability power based champs have built-in slows or have true damage as part of their kits like Vel'Koz and Gwen. So as a tank, it's very hard to deal with those characters, especially when they build Morellonomicon. Right now, as an AD champion, you're almost always going to build Mortal Reminder because Chempunk Chainsword just does not give enough in stats to be worth it for a lot of characters. Now, what if it's not utility? What if you just want a creative build? Well, Essence Reaver no longer has the Sheen proc, so you can't build that on GP or Riven if you for that matter, which I used to do when I was newer at the game, because I mean it was a fun build to go crit Lethality Riven. But now you're always going to build that same Bruiser or Infinity Edge build if you're a Gangplank main almost every single game. I think the items also bleed into the Keystones a little bit, as Keystones have been streamlined in a way that makes them very, very brain dead. Conqueror was a very interesting rune during season 10 and 9 because you did a percent of your damage as true damage and healed for it, meaning that you always had sustain. Now it just gives you a flat AD buff, and if the enemy's tanky enough, it can just deny your proc on Conqueror. And by deny it, I mean reduce the healing so much that it feels like you don't even have the Keystone. Sometimes I think it would be better to go back to that older version of Conqueror that not everyone could use because the sustain was so decent on bruisers and fighting champions, but nowadays it feels like it's almost better to go fleet on some bruisers or even just going PTA. Conqueror is in this weird state of just being a very matchup dependent rune that you're only really going to build into other bruisers. Sometimes you can't even build that into tanks, and sometimes you want to build that into tanks. Some characters, that's the only Keystone they can run consistently, but then we look at other champions and they can go 1, 2, maybe even 3 Keystones, and a lot of them are mages. Almost every mage that has a stun can go a very safe build with Arcane Comet, Airy, or Glacial Augment. If they want to go for damage, they can build Electrocute, they can build Dark Harvest. Champions like Mordekaiser and Gwen, they can go PTA, they can go Lethal Tempo, they can go Conqueror, they can go Grasp the Undying. Because their kits are so well rounded, they can pretty much do whatever to the opponent if they know the matchup well enough. And you could say this for a lot of other AD champions, but for most AD champions, especially Aatrox, even Darius, I don't see them ever going anything other than Phase Rush, Conqueror, and that's pretty much it. Very few bruisers at this point will go any other Keystone, maybe in specific matchups like set building Grasp into tanks. And also the removal of runes like Predator really reduced the amount of variety some champions can build like Nunu. And I know Nunu's an AP champion, but I do like the ability of roaming. Hey, I see you made it halfway through this video. If it's around the 10-minute mark, I would like to thank you for watching this far, and currently I'm sitting at 20 subscribers, so if you could share, like, and subscribe to this video, that would be much appreciated. Thank you. Anyways, back to the main video. And I also see that it is kind of redundant when you have keystones like Relentless Hunter that give you out of combat movement speed. The Predator was a really interesting rune because it only gave you movement speed into the direction of enemy champions for a very brief amount of time. I'm more surprised that they never reworked it to a point to where most characters could use it and actually buff it in a way. The fact that it had an entire icon and people were unable to react to a roam, especially in higher levels of play, is kind of insane to me. You would think Predator would be this insanely broken keystone, but it just kinda didn't really do much, even despite its glaring strengths and weaknesses. This is also the same reason why we have keystones like First Strike instead of Kleptomancy, and Kleptomancy was a really fun rune on a lot of champions, but nowadays it's just non-existent. Runes in earlier League had so much benefit, but now they feel like a secondary to your champion, which I don't know if that's intentional or not. But you should feel the power of the rune you pick whenever you boot up this game. It's like going lethal tempo on an ADC. Not every champion should feel like their keystone doesn't add anything to their character. Most healing supports will never go Shield Bash or even go Font of Life, and these are keystones you would think would add a great deal to the healing that they can put out. But the numbers are so low because it's very obvious that Riot doesn't want them to be good runes, because I can see the potential of them being broken in higher levels of play, but it also reduces the fun factor of looking at all the runes and all the different combinations you can do. I think Riot at some point should either go back to the mythic system or get rid of the legend and mythic system entirely. Items like Iceborne Gauntlet feel very hit or miss, and I miss items like Frozen Mallet because they felt like they had their place in their niche. Having items just feel like they're part of my core build means every single game is going to feel the exact same. And the mythic system at least gave you the benefit of feeling like when you got your core item, you had an amazing power spike. Nothing felt better as an ADC than building your Immortal Shield Bow into whatever your secondary item was, because you felt like you had this immense power spike, but nowadays it just doesn't feel that way anymore. When I look at Immortal Shield Bow, I look at an item that doesn't need to exist anymore. You see this item every once in a while. It's an anti-burst item, but in most matchups you still just get bursted through the shield, so it's almost non-existent. The main issue is I feel like Riot just didn't take enough time when they removed the mythic system and just kind of threw all these items to the wayside and just lowered the damage on all of them across the board, which leads to this weird feeling where your damage is very inconsistent, yet you're building the same items, but each matchup you just feel like you do less and less damage. This also bleeds into the buffing of AP items across the board. Zanya's giving 105, I believe, ability power, which is insane for such a defensive item. But for other champions like AD champions, when they build a defensive item, they don't get as much AD as their core. So it's almost like a flip-flop between both ratios. For AP champions, they get higher late game scaling and even bigger safety, but for AD champions, they get less scaling for building something safe. It almost doesn't make any sense at the end of the day. Why should my ADC deserve to get bursted because they decided to build a safe item, but my mid lane mage can build Zanya's second item, and it feels like they didn't lose any value for doing that? And if we're going to do that, we need to also just look at what objectives do for us as a team. With the way feats are right now, you can lock the enemy out of getting a substantial buff. Now, higher level players know that the gold value on these boots isn't that great, but into some matchups these boots can be like game winning. Having Armored Advance on any bruiser right now gives them a 4% bonus health scaling shield that every time they get hit, they get either a magic or AD, depending on the boot they buy, shield. And some characters just can't do anything after a character gets that at this point. Kale into anyone building those boots feels like an awful champion, even when she's going lethal tempo, because all the damage she does afterward is just not going to matter because of the boots they build. And it doesn't matter if she goes AD or AP, because it just cuts the damage in half basically. And with that, it's what's the point of giving that much power to one team? You get punished extremely hard for not playing aggressive, but then you get all these extremely safe items later into the game anyway. So it makes playing early game a struggle, because you don't know if your team is going to play for feats or not. And then if you lose feats, some of the matchups make it impossible to come back at this point. And God forbid you give the enemy team feats, because at this point, if they have 6 grubs, you are going to lose that game. That gives everyone on that enemy team the capability of split pushing on their own. It could be a support, it could be the enemy AD carry, it could be a mage with negative attack speed, and they are going to outpush 4 people on your team combined until it's 40 minutes into the game, which means you're constantly getting pressured all the time. A lot of Season 15 feels like every single day, every single game, you are on the line from the very beginning of the match start. There's no tempo to this either. Sometimes an invade could lose you the game off the bat. Sometimes it's a slow burn and you lose feats at 15 minutes. You really don't know when you're going to lose feats. I can't tell if it's a theme with competitive games right now and just being more aggressive, or if it's just a phase. We went from items giving too much value to items giving little to no value for certain characters, and right now I just can't tell where League's heading to at this point. With the theming around Noxus, I can understand that maybe that's what they wanted to go with, but what will it be if we go to Ionia or Demacia? Will the meta shift in a favorable way? I don't know. I can't tell anymore. Maybe we'll stay like this until the end of the year. Maybe next year they revert everything and we go back to the mythic system. I can never tell with Riot Games at this point. Sometimes a character like Victor gets reworked out of nowhere and all of his numbers get buffed. Sometimes LeBlanc comes out from a rework and nothing has changed at all. You really never know at all. In the past, when I first started League, you used to have reworks come out, and it was very blatant that whoever was working on the rework loved that character. Nowadays, a character comes out, and sometimes the rework is completely boring or a failure. Skarner has an amazing new design, and every time I see new Skarner, it feels like I'm looking at a brick wall. He's not fun to fight, play as, or play with on your team, compared to old Skarner, who was a very strong bruiser who had the potential to pick people on his own. And now that's completely gone. Now we just have this tank that stuns people, can't die, and does no damage himself. Maybe he does damage to AD carries, but he definitely can't damage other bruisers, and I don't understand the point of it. I understand with over 150 characters at this point, some characters are going to get left in the dust. Some won't become meta defining for years to come. Some were extremely strong when they came out, and you just barely see anymore because of the amount of effort it takes to climb on them. I rarely see Aurelia anymore. Akali is very niche at this point, and Samira went from being the biggest lane bully to now being bullied by immobile AD carries into 90% of her matchups. Right now it is spring and I'm very optimistic for the future of this game, but I can't sugarcoat that right now items feel like crap when you play as AD champions across the board right now. Hoping in the future that Riot actually takes time and thinks about the items that they add to the game, or items that they leave in the game at this point. I hope League in the future becomes a game with a lot more variety in item builds and we go back to a rune system reminiscent of what they were doing in 2020. League is a very interesting game, but a game can only be alive for so long, and I really do hope it succeeds in its future. Well, this is the longest video I've ever recorded. I wanted to say thank you for anyone that watched this all the way through, and in the meantime, I'll catch you later.